So we have a fantastic panel, which I will bring up. I'll introduce myself and the panel a little bit later, but to set the scene, we have a presentation, first of all, from Mega Mukim, who is a senior economist with the World Bank. And Mega has done a lot of work looking at the impacts of climate in this region and also what we can do about it. So to set the scene and get us started, ready for the panel discussion, Mega, please come up and give us your presentation. Thank you.
Great. Perfect. Thank you very much. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I realize we're already eating into your lunchtime. Thanks for being here. My name's Mega, as Jim introduced me. I'm working with the World Bank, and I'm essentially going to present some work that we finished last year. It's called a Country Climate and Development Report. I'm not going to keep saying that. I'm going to use the word CCDR. This is something that the World Bank has been doing in many of our client countries, and we just finished something last year for the Western Balkans, 6 countries. A little bit of background about what is a CCDR. Essentially, the point of the report is to try and understand how climate change is going to affect the growth and development trajectories of our client countries, and exactly what they can do to respond to that going forward. So I'm going to share with you in the next 15 minutes exactly what we found as part of our work, and then leave it to the very interesting panel to discuss it further. So these are the 6 natural hazards that we studied as part of the CCDR work that we did for the Western Balkans. 5 of these natural hazards are directly related to a changing climate. And one of them, which is earthquakes, has nothing to do with climate change, but nonetheless we study it because the response to seismic risk in our countries actually has a lot to do with the response to all of the other natural hazards going forward. I do want to mention here that there was already a lot of existing data and analysis that was out there in the Western Balkans, and the team put together and brought in all of that information, but we also went out and we collected a lot of new data. We looked at data at a much more micro-geographical scale. We looked at new data that allowed us to look at things as they would go on in the future. And there were some natural hazards that weren't as well studied. For example, wildfires, very difficult to get data and information on, landslides. So there were some natural hazards where we had to go out and collect data for the first time. So we've put all this data together. For any of those of you that are interested in looking at it, this data is publicly available. You just need to get in touch with myself or Christopher at the World Bank, and we'd be happy to share that data set with you going forward. So let me share with you some of our key findings from the report, and then I'll leave with you some ideas of what can be done in response to these key findings. The first key finding that we have from the report, just so that the guys at the back know, I actually can't see the PowerPoint here, but that's okay. I know it by heart, but I can't see the time either. So the first thing that we find in the report is that the climate impacts are going to be extremely volatile. You're going to have a lot more stressors. So when I say stressors, I mean things that are predictable but are slow-moving onset stressors. Think about extreme heat. Or think about droughts. The season is reasonably well known, and you know that they're going to get worse year by year, and it's easier to predict when and where this is going to happen. We find that the stressors are going to get worse. This is not any surprise to those of you in the room. We also see that the shocks, which are far more unpredictable, so think about landslides or wildfires or flash floods, where it's a little bit harder to see exactly when they're going to happen or when they're going to take place, the shocks are also going to get worse over time. I'll give you an example of rainfall, which makes this point really well. So over the next, say, 20 to 30 years, we know that average rainfall is going to go down by about 8.5%, which means that the Western Balkan region is going to get drier and drier over the future. However, at the same time, the onset of flash floods is going to get far worse. So even though the region is becoming drier, you're actually going to get far worse flooding and far more unpredictable flooding in certain parts of different countries in the Western Balkans. And this is why we talk about the fact that the climate impacts are going to get worse in terms of intensity, but they're also going to be a lot more volatile. And that obviously matters for investors, it matters for governments, it matters for households and firms, because it becomes much more unpredictable in terms of risk-taking and in terms of behaviors going forward. The second thing that I want to talk about is how these impacts are compounding and cascading. So I'm talking about these natural hazards, floods, droughts, wildfires, landslides, as though they're somehow individual natural hazards or individual events. They're not. They are connected to one another. They compound with one another, they interact with one another, and they make the total impact a lot worse, but they also cascade across space. That means geographically, the impact cascades. So again, I'd like to give you an example to illustrate what I mean. I mentioned that the Western Balkan region is going to become drier over time. And the reason for that is that you're going to have a lot more extreme heat in the region. So your summers are going to become hotter. The summers are going to become drier, and the summers are going to become longer over time from what we expect to see. What that means is that when you have hotter, longer, and drier summers, you're going to have much higher probability of droughts in the future. When you have more probability of droughts, you actually have much higher intensity and probability of wildfires. And as you know, wildfires tend to destroy the upper layer of vegetation in your countries, which then means that after your long, dry, hot summers, when you do have rainfall, that rainfall is normally in large bursts, and that means you actually tend to have more flash floods when the rains come. And those flash floods are more likely to turn into landslides because the wildfires have destroyed a lot of your upper vegetation. So if you see, if you're thinking about a farmer or you're thinking about, residential homes or firms that are reacting to this, they're essentially not dealing with one natural hazard. They're dealing with repeated natural hazards that have a compounding effect on what it is that they have to deal with going forward. Since I can't see my time right now, I'm just going to make a quick digression about some work that we did on the side on extreme heat. Last year, we went out in a lot of our client countries in the summer of 2023, and we went out and we collected data on the 2 or 3 hottest days in some cities on how hot it was getting in different parts of the city. So we went out and we collected hundreds of thousands of observations with a number of volunteers, and we found that not only were cities a lot hotter than the neighboring environments, but we also found that there was a lot of difference within the same city in terms of the temperatures, or what we call thermal inequality. So for example, in Mostar, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, we found that temperature differentials on a hot day were anything about 7.2 degrees Celsius on the same time, at the same day in 2 different parts of the city. So you're essentially finding that climate impacts fall in different places in different ways, and that brings me to the next point. I'm talking about all of this as though it's some kind of average phenomenon across different countries and so on. But in fact, we know that the way that the climate is going to have an impact is going to be different for different places and different for different sets of people and different sets of populations. What we do as part of our work is go down to the level of municipalities in the Western Balkans, and we try and understand how municipalities were already vulnerable. So let's assume there is no climate change. What do we know about municipalities in the region? How are they vulnerable in terms of socio-economic phenomenon? We look at things like demographic decline, which is a huge issue in the Western Balkans. We look at levels of unemployment. We look at isolation, how much infrastructure they have already. We look at educational attainments and so on and so forth. And then we try and see what happens to places that are already vulnerable when you actually have climate change that affects these places. And we find, for instance, that some places that are already vulnerable because they are more isolated or because they have more demographic decline are also some of the places that actually have worse climate impacts, which means as public policy makers, you're looking at some lagging regions in your countries where you now need to think about even worse climate impacts coming down the line. I also want to talk about the fact that I'm again talking as though all of this is exogenous, right? This already exists, and whatever happens with climate change is something that you're going to have to deal with. We find, in fact, that public policy might already be making things worse on the ground, and I'd like to give the example of urban settlements. So we know that in terms of demographic, in terms of population, most, not all, but most of Western Balkan cities are shrinking over time. At the same time, most Western Balkan cities are also sprawling. So even though the number of people in your cities is not growing or is actually going down, at the same time, the actual geographic area that the cities are taking over is growing over time. Now, as a trained economist, I know that's bad because it's going to make it far more expensive to provide public service delivery, to build infrastructure, and so on. But even keeping that aside, from the point of view of risk and climate exposure, we find that the cities are sprawling, that they are growing in areas that already have high exposure. So for instance, exposure to floods is increasing in the Western Balkans, not only because you're going to have more flash floods, but also because cities are growing in areas where you're going to have more flash floods. And this is something that public policy can do a lot about upfront, simply with regulations in place, which would make it so that people are not building in places that are going to be more exposed to climate risks in the future. Okay, so now that I can see a lot of worried faces in the room, maybe I can turn back to what it is that we say we can do about this going forward. In the Western Balkans CCDR report, and I would encourage you to reach out and read it, all of them are available online, we talk about why it's important to have urgency of action. So hopefully I've made the case for why action should be urgent when you're thinking about adaptation to climate change in the future. And we use a simple framework, which tells you why what are the costs of inaction. So if you were to do absolutely nothing as households, as firms, as governments, what would be the damage that would be caused to your economies going forward? We come up with an estimate for the Western Balkans, which is somewhere around 9% of GDP per year, but this is an extremely low bound estimate. This doesn't take into account wildfires, it doesn't take into account landslides, it is unable to account for all the compounding and the cascading impacts that I was talking about. Unfortunately, the economic science to try and measure this is not as good as the climate science, or is not keeping up with the climate science. So we know that on average, you're going to have a loss of about 9% per GDP, which is already a big loss, and this is going to be a lower bound cost going up. I'll talk a little bit about what you can do to invest in adaptation. So if you were to take some kind of action to respond to climate change, what would be the cost of that action? And then the third, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what would be the benefits of making those investments or changing your policies and regulatory frameworks in response to climate change. So let me start with the costs of action. For those of you who are interested in really looking at what this means in terms of response, we went through a very, very bottom-up ground-level exercise at looking at country by country the national adaptation plans, the climate change strategies. We looked at projects that governments have already financed, projects that governments are saying they would like to finance, and we put together our own estimates, our own internal estimates in terms of the experts that we have in the bank for different sectors: transport, health, education, urban, disaster risk management, and we come up with a point-by-point costing of what it is that all of the different countries in the Western Balkans could do in terms of the investments going forward. So when I say investments in World Bank speak, what I mean is bricks and mortar investments in infrastructure, but also in terms of policy reform. What is it that they can change in terms of regulations, in terms of the regulatory infrastructure that you have set up there? And we try and cost those out and provide timelines of some policies that should be front-loaded, investments that should be front-loaded. And most importantly, because a number of these countries are EU accession countries, we also talk about what part of these investments or policy changes would be something that you would be doing in any case if you were thinking about accession to the EU. So it's very much aligned with what the countries are thinking about in terms of their future. Oh, and sorry, and our number is 37 billion. I know it's a very scary number. That number applies for the next sort of couple of decades, but in terms of adaptation investments, you really want to make them upfront. So we're talking about the next 10 to 15 years where you would need to find the money to make those investments going forward. And I'll come back to where in the world that money is going to come from. What will be the benefits of those investments that you would have to make? And for this, I can say that there's some good news. So we do estimates of what would be the benefits associated with these investments, and we find on average there would be about, for every euro that would be invested, you would expect to see about 2 to 10 euros in terms of the benefits that you would receive. And what would be the benefits? There's a triple dividend framework that is often used in this space, and that covers 3 things. It's essentially talking about what would be the avoided losses. That's the simplest. What would be the property saved, the lives saved if you were to make the adaptation investments going forward. The second thing would be what would be the amplified economic benefits. What would be the jobs that would be created? What would be the GDP impacts that you would see over time if these investments were to take place. And then the third is sort of the core benefits that you would, thank you. The core benefits that you would expect to see, environmental co-benefits, social co-benefits, and so on, that are associated with these investments for communities, for nature-based solutions, and so on and so forth. And again, in the report, we talk a little bit in detail, this is just a quick graph, about what would be the benefits associated with different typologies of investments going forward. As you can see, some of them have smaller BCRs, benefit cost ratios, or returns on investments. Some of them are absolutely massive. So for example, early warning systems are about 100 times in terms of the cost of early warning systems. The benefits are 100-fold over time. Okay, you don't have to look at all of this, and I'm sure that the organizers are going to share the slides with you. But I do want to talk a little bit about what international financial institutions can actually do to help. As I'm speaking on behalf of the World Bank, but speaking more generally for IFIs overall, essentially there are a couple of ways that international financial institutions can help our client countries on this. So one of them very clearly is to help on policy. A lot of the work that we're doing is talking to ministries of finance, talking to central bank governors, and telling them not only about the risks, but also telling them that there are certain fiscal and regulatory policies that they can put in place, which would allow them to respond to climate change over time. I gave you a couple of examples, but also they can think a little bit about disaster risk financing and disaster risk insurance over time, which allows them to be much better prepared when a disaster hits, which provides them with better liquidity so that they're not going out to banks, or they're not going out to donors and expecting them to come in and provide financing, or even worse, redirecting funds from education or healthcare to respond to disasters because they really haven't thought through what the fiscal impacts would be to respond to disasters over time. So thinking a little bit about disaster risk financing. We can think about parametric insurance. I gave the example, for instance, of farmers who are really badly affected by climate change over time, how you can use parametric insurance to try and insure small farmers over time and to adapt to climate change. You could also think about country-level catastrophe bonds. The idea of a catastrophe bond is that you have a trigger. The trigger could be a flood, a wildfire, an earthquake, and when that trigger is met in a catastrophe bond, then essentially the bond pays out. At the World Bank, we also have catastrophe bonds, which we've used in about 40 other countries. In the region, we've had one in Serbia that was a couple of years ago, but catastrophe bonds also allow for quick payout of money right after a disaster, again, so that the government is not then scrambling for resources to respond to this. And again, I'm sure that it will be interesting to discuss this further with the panel. So let me leave you here. I think my time is up. This is the report that I talked about. There's actually one report for the region. There are two background reports for those of you who really want to delve into the numbers and understand how in the world we came up with these figures that I'm quoting at you. And then if you're actually interested in your own country and you really want to dig deep into what this means for a particular country, we also have a report for each one of the 6 countries. So let me stop there and turn back to Jim. Thank you.